My job is to talk about shade tree pruning at first. So shade tree, that's kind of a loose term, but it's a tree that you might have in your front yard, maybe one that you're planning on purchasing this coming spring. And of course, pruning is an extremely important topic, and we find that if we don't prune properly, we can have problems down the road. So that'll be the nature of at least my portion of this lecture tonight. So what are some guiding principles, some things that I keep in the back of my mind when I'm purchasing trees or looking to prune trees in my own yard or in an extension effort? So here's a red maple planted in a parking lot planting right next to my favorite Dunkin' Donuts here in town. And I'll use that as kind of a guide to describe what some of the things I try to keep in mind. First off, when you're pruning anything, I try to take the long view. I try to think about the future and what will that tree look 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And then I have to prune accordingly, realizing that what you see on the screen, a lot of those branches won't even be there 40 years from now. And so that's an important consideration. We'll talk about mechanics, the proper mechanics of removing branches, and we'll get to that in just a minute. On shade trees, I always try to develop a central leader or favor a central leader. There are some species that play along really well and others that will fight you to the death trying to develop central leaders, but that's something else I consider. Good branch spacing. I don't want my branches too close together, and I'll show you a picture about that a bit later on. This is really important for young trees. I like to see about 2/3 of the tree in living tissue, living branches. And so this is a good tree to look at too, because about 2/3 of that tree is in greenery. And there's a reason for that. Quite simply, you end up with trees that have better stem diameter, better stem development when you do this, or allow them to have lower branches. That's extremely important. I try to prune branches before they get too large. So the smaller the wound, the easier it is for that tree to cope with that wound. And let's make no mistake about it, pruning is wounding to the tree. The tree doesn't differentiate a pruning wound from a scuff from a lawnmower. So we try to keep the wound small. Of course, timing's important. I think an annual visit to your trees, sometimes twice a year, is important. And finally, just do it. Start early with trees and stay with it until they get too large, and then you call in the professionals. So, basic rules of the road. Always prune at nodes. And what I'm showing on the left there is a branch. And if I wanted to shorten that branch, I would prune back to a node, or in this case, back to buds. That's the proper place to prune. Or at a connection point. So the picture on the right shows you a branch or a twig being removed back to its point of origin. Those are appropriate places to remove branches. We never prune internodally or between nodes. That's just a no-no in pruning, regardless of the size of the plant. So here's a photo of some branches that could be removed, and notice they're all being removed back to their points of origin, and those are appropriate places to go. That is a bad place to prune. We're pruning between nodes and you leave a stub, then all kinds of bad things happen. So pretty good diagram there. When I'm taking a branch off of a shade tree, I look for certain landmarks, and perhaps you've heard about these things before. I think they're important to remember, to refresh your memory on. And so on a lot of shade trees, you will have a structure called a branch bark ridge, which is simply a ridge of bark that is in the intersection between the trunk and the branch in question. I always look for that branch bark ridge, and maybe more importantly, I look for the collar, that swollen area that tends to encompass the branch. And my pruning cuts are always made to the outside of the branch bark ridge and to the outside of the trunk collar. And I like to employ a 3-cut method of removing branches that would go something like this. My first cut on the bottom side of the branch, my second cut to the outside in a downward fashion, and then my final cut back, again, just as we talked about, outside the branch bark ridge and outside the collar. The reason I do that is that if you're removing a branch, especially in the spring of the year, and you make only one cut, the branch could rip and cause big time damage. And so that undercut, that very first cut you make, will stop the branch from ripping down the side of the tree and embarrassing you in front of your kids, family, and neighbors. So I think that's a good way to go. So here's another example of the first cut being on the bottom side of the branch, the second cut on the top side. And then if a branch does happen to break or begin to rip, it'll stop at that undercut. So just more examples. One of the reasons that we aim for those targets, the primary reason, of course, is to make us the smallest wound possible. Remember back in the day when you'd make a flush cut, you leave an awfully big wound. And so following these targets, you make a smaller wound. But maybe more importantly, we also prevent injury to something called a branch protection zone. And it's a zone at the base of the branch that limits decay from spreading back into the tree. And if we violate that branch protection zone by cutting too close to the trunk, we can encourage decay. So another reason why we try to hit these landmarks. This person who pruned this branch got too close, and the classic calling card for that is the lack of callus tissue forming completely around the wound. So we know that somebody got too close here. They probably injured the branch protection zone, and decay might ensue. So we don't want that. What we'd want to see, what we'd rather see, is callus, which eventually becomes wound wood, forming around that wound face like a donut. And with any luck, over a couple of years, that wound will actually close over, and we call that encapsulation. If you're looking for new words to use around the dinner table tomorrow night. And remember, trees, woody plants don't heal. They close over, they compartmentalize. They always, once you make a wound on a woody plant, it's there for the life of the plant. But with any luck, the tree or shrub will compartmentalize or wall off that area so decay doesn't spread throughout the tree. When I'm looking at young trees, I try to correct flaws before they become major problems. And on a young plant, I'm going to look for codominant stems, sometimes called multiple leaders, which are never good. Remember right at the outset, we talked about developing a central leader. And so this is the antithesis of that. And of course, when you have double leaders, you often have something called included bark. And it's a weak point in the tree. And it could be a place where the tree fails. So it's a little late to do something about this tree, but if that tree were 10 years younger, you would take one of those competing leaders off and avoid a potential problem down the road. Here's an example of a shade tree. This is a maple with codominant stems, included bark, and you can see what's happened. And the tree is essentially wasted now. I mean, I guess you could try to use some hardware to shore it up, but that tree has really a shortened life, shorter than it should have had. So back in the nursery or early in its days in the landscape, one of those leaders should have been removed, and it would have prevented this problem. Now here's a tree with codominant stems, but it's not as dire of a situation as the one we just looked at. Notice that there's a branch bark ridge between those competing leaders, which indicates strength, a stronger union. So while I don't like this, it's certainly not as bad as the picture that we just viewed. Included bark is a term we throw around a lot. In this case, you can see a linden, and we don't see the evidence of a branch bark ridge or even a collar. In fact, if you look at the junction between the branch and the main stem, you can see how the bark is kind of turned in on itself. And again, included bark could be a sign of weakness. But maybe more importantly for this discussion, it's awfully hard to prune a branch that has included bark. In fact, instead of getting your saw blade between the branch and the trunk, you have to come at the removal process from below. So notice the picture in the bottom right there. My final cut is made starting at the base of the branch and moving back towards the trunk. It's a bit more tricky, but there's no way you can fit your blade in between the branch and the main stem. Here's another example of a linden, which they do this a lot, coming at the removal of that branch from the bottom side. So those are mechanics. And again, the whole idea is to keep those wounds small. The late Dr. Paul Ray used to say, get them off before they get to 2 inches. I'd even shoot for something a little bit smaller, but remember, small wounds are easier for the tree to cope with, and that should be one of our primary guiding principles. If you prune trees this time of the year, or maybe in a few weeks, you will see some fluid escaping from the wound. We see this a lot on birch and maple, and it really doesn't cause any damage to the tree. It looks alarming, but that is one of the side effects of pruning in that late dormant season, which I'm a big fan of. But you will get this, so um, don't worry too much about it. Here's an example of a tree that has been over pruned. So maybe almost as bad as not pruning at all is pruning too much. Notice how all the lower branches are missing from this tree. Remember, one of our guiding principles was 2/3 of the tree in crown, and we don't have that here. And I think it retards the stem diameter or the stem development of the tree. I don't think it, I know that's what happens. And so try your best to leave those lower branches on for as long as you can. Okay, so some real life examples. This is a street here in Ames, and hopefully you're looking at this street and saying, wow, somebody was asleep at the switch, because there's all kinds of problems that need to be addressed here, up and down the street. And this is what I love to talk about pruning, because there's so much good that can be done out there. And there's a lot of trees that could use your help. So hopefully you'll get out there and do some work in your own communities. But again, think about structure, take the long view. Obviously, those lower branches can't remain on those trees because they'll interfere with vehicular traffic. Here's another example. In fact, look at the nice wide boulevard. Boy, I wish we all had boulevards to plant trees in like that. But I want to focus on that tree down the road. This is a very popular tree called autumn blaze maple. But one thing I always ask myself, where is my first permanent scaffold branch going to be on a shade tree? And it might be that first line. It could be a little higher up in the canopy. The fact of the matter is, everything below those lines is temporary. Those branches are fulfilling a valuable function, but they're temporary. They won't be there in years to come. And so we have to take that into account, and also remember wound size. Now that one branch, it's not going off to the right, is a little bit large. That branch should have been taken off a while ago. Yeah, but you can't fix everything at once. What I might do this winter is take these lower branches off and then call it good, remembering that I can do too much pruning at one time. But that might be a good first start on that tree. Here's another one along a rather busy thoroughfare here in Ames. Do you see a branch that probably should come out, or probably should have come out a while ago? And it's that one that I've highlighted there on the left. It's a large branch, too large, has some included bark, and that's one that I would focus on and remove right away. Here's another branch on another maple with the included bark that needs to come off. Notice the included bark there. And so the proper pruning cut, the proper mechanics would be to make a cut there, remove the weight of the branch, and then finally make my final cut either there or there. Remember, the guiding principle is make the smallest wound possible. So this is a tree in front of my house. It's a city tree, but it's a really nice plant. Notice how I have asked them to leave the tree alone. So 2/3 of the tree is in branches. That's a good thing. Now I've got to get out there and do some work. This is an oak, by the way. And so make note, we only prune oaks during the dormant season. There's a disease called oak wilt that will lie in wait of trees that are opened up or pruned during the growing season. So we only prune oak trees when they're dormant, and this is a great time of the year to prune oak trees. Okay, so where's my first permanent scaffold branch? Is it there? Is it there? Could be one of those, but remember, everything below that line is temporary. So what do? Do I take all those branches off tomorrow? No, that would be too much pruning all at one time. And so what I might do is remove that branch, perhaps that one, and maybe that one, and then call it good. But what else could I do? So pay attention to that branch there. What if I decide that branch needs to come out someday, and it does, but I don't want to take it out this particular year? So what I might do is suppress it. This word suppression is very valuable. So I'm going to take off the major part of that branch in 2023, and then come back and remove it entirely in 2024. Now, why would I do that? Well, remember, I want to create a small wound when I remove the branch, but I can't take too much off all at one time. And so by reducing the leaf area on that branch, I'm going to slow it down. And that in effect will slow the diameter growth of that branch back where it meets the trunk. So it does two things for me. It's ugly, and it reminds me that I got to go back in 2024 and take it off, but I don't take too much off at one time. So here's another example of a suppression cut. I might take that part of the branch off this spring, come back and get the rest of it off in 2024. Again, that's called a suppression cut or staged branch removal. And it helps me prune up to a point, and then it allows me to come back and finish the job in subsequent years. And I think it's a very useful technique. I talked about the importance of branch spacing. So here's an example of a tree that needs some attention because there are just way too many branches there. Ideally, I would like to see branches alternating up the stem and kind of revolving around the main trunk like spokes of a wheel. There's just too much going on here, and that needs to be addressed. Let's look at another example. Again, where's my first permanent scaffold branch? Should it be there? Should it be higher? I submit that it can't be at that first line because this is a sugar maple. It's going to be a large tree someday, and those lower branches are well, they're much too low to the ground. And so what I might do in 2023 is take that branch off. And so let's zoom in on it on the right. Again, I'm going to practice my 3-cut technique, and then maybe call it good, because I'm definitely afraid of pruning too much on young plants. Here's an example of a suppression cut I might do on another young sugar maple. You can see the branch that I'm pointing at. So I might suppress it in 2023, then come back in 24 and take it off completely. And there's probably some other suppression cuts I can do on this tree, which will allow me to slow the growth of those branches down without taking them completely off. Another example, look at this plant. This is what drives me nuts. So when I see a tree like this, I'm both kind of disgusted, but I'm also jazzed because you can do so much good for this plant. If you just walked by it and didn't do anything, well, it would be a disaster 5 years. So I divide the tree into regions, if you will. So that lower region is the removal zone. Those branches need to come off like today, right? That middle zone, I'll call the suppression zone, where I'm going to do some suppression cuts, maybe take some of the weight off the branches, and with the idea that I'm going to come back in subsequent years and clean up the mess. I'm going to look up top and look for competing leaders or codominant stems. And then I'm going to look for branches that are outgrowing the canopy and maybe remove those back to their point of origin. We call those reduction cuts. So there's lots and lots of work to be done here. When I drove by this thing, I thought I should just get out and start whacking away in the tree. But that sometimes will get you in trouble, folks. So always get permission before you start pruning trees. Hey, what about timing? That's an important topic. I've never killed a tree by pruning at the wrong time of the year. Remember, oaks, don't violate that rule. But you can prune almost any time of the year. But I think if the tree had a say in it, well, he or she might say this. There's some fancy words on the screen here. Realize that if you prune in October, November, you could cause some tissue death. So I'm not a big fan of October, November. March and April are good because trees respond as they begin growing in the spring. Wound wood, we talked about that wood that forms around the wound face grows very quickly from April to June. And this whole idea of trees compartmentalizing wounds takes place, shouldn't surprise you, takes place when the tree is actively growing. So what's best for the tree? Well, April to August might be the best time for the tree. The worst time would be September to January, but you got to be practical. I'm a big fan of dormant season pruning, late dormant season in particular. So February and March are great times of the year to get out and prune because the leaves are gone. The tree will begin to cope with those wounds as it begins to grow in the spring. And so you've got a pretty wide window there. Just remember the special case with oak and try to avoid fall pruning and maybe a few weeks in April when trees are breaking bud and leafing out. Because as you know, the bark rips very easily at that time of the year. I like this quote, prune the branches that no longer belong to the future. Sometimes it's hard to tell when that is, but I've always enjoyed that quote. So that's a quick tour of shade tree pruning. But But I'll now turn it over to Billy Beck, Dr. Beck, and we'll come back and answer questions later on. So Billy, the show is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. That was amazing. I love talking pruning and tree physiology. But gosh, thank y'all for joining us on a cold, wintry Thursday night here in Iowa. So I just actually literally just got off the plane from sunny southern Alabama. So back to reality. Let's see here. All right, that looks good. I'm going to switch it up
Billy?
a little bit here. Yes.
We are actually seeing your presenter side, like with the notes and everything,
Oh, perfect. Okay.
and not just the one slide at a time.
Okay. Let me, how about now?
Now we're seeing it just as, nope, it's still the same.
Okay. 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing here. Sorry about this.
While Billy's getting that up and running, Jeff, do you want to take a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
What's the best month to prune oak trees? I think you talked about it, but can we remind people?
Yeah, I pick a nice day in February. We're going to get some warm weather here in a couple days. I'm not a big fan of pruning when it's 20 below, so just to pick out a nice day in February, early March, and that should work.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff.
Gosh darn it. All right.
We'll do one more Jeff question. Jeff, how does one determine the permanent scaffold in a tree?
Yeah, well, take the long view again. If you planted a white oak in your yard, just picture a white oak and how big those things get. And if you're going to want to walk under the tree someday, then that gives you some idea. So the first permanent scaffold branch on a white oak in a park, maybe it's 8 foot off the ground. In a home landscape, it could be higher. So you want to keep that in mind, and that's why you have to plan for the future. So there's no easy way to determine that. And sometimes on a young tree, the first permanent scaffold branch is still a twinkle in that tree's eye. It's not even there. So you've got, that's why I like revisiting trees on an annual basis or maybe twice a year.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay. Oh, gosh. All right.
I think we can go with just this view if you want.
Yeah, this is every time I disconnect my laptop and go traveling, the settings get all screwy. So I really apologize for this.
That's okay. Oh, there, that's perfect now.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, sorry about the delay there, but it was good to get some more questions for Dr. Iles because he is the true shade tree expert. My name is Billy Beck. Again, I thank you so much for joining us today. I'm the Extension Forestry Specialist. I focus mostly on rural forests, as Alicia alluded to earlier, and really my focus is water quality, but I'm a big proponent of introducing trees and forestry into the agricultural systems, not only for the ecosystem goods and services they provide, but also farmer bottom lines. And one of those critical infrastructure that trees provide are windbreaks, and windbreaks commonly have a major conifer component. So Jeff hit on a lot of the core pruning topics and concepts that you should keep in mind for this, but I'm going to hit a little bit on conifer pruning. So I've always got kind of a rural windbreak spin to this, but they are a little bit different. All right. Okay. So really quick, just some conifer physiology, the basics. They're a little bit different than our deciduous friends. So kind of want to hit on some conifer physiology, and then a little bit of some quick ID. I really think that you need to know the players out there before you start messing around, starting pruning these things. And then some big concepts on conifer pruning. Fortunately, they're a little bit easier than our deciduous friends, which is good for me. But just some big concepts. There's not really enough time today to go over everything and all about conifer pruning. So some big things to keep in mind, some things I see people get tripped up on. And then if we have time, I've got some kind of special case slides just talking about what to do with multiple leaders, like Jeff alluded to, and then what do we do with storm damage in conifers, which you saw a lot of this after the derecho. All right, well, conifers, as I said, are a little bit different. Well, of course, obviously, they're a little bit different than our deciduous friends. And one of the main things that makes them different is that they have what's called an X-current form. What that means is they have a dominant leader and they have a very symmetrical form. So if you look at conifers, they're actually quite symmetrical. They've got a dominant leader and they've got a very wide branch angle as compared to some of the shots that Jeff showed you earlier. They've got a large angle between the main stem and the lateral branches there. So they've got large angles of attachment. So thus, they kind of need less training when they're young, less pruning in general than our deciduous counterparts. So really, a lot of times when you're thinking about pruning conifers, it's about addressing disease, addressing damage, things like that. So we really love keeping the natural form of conifers. So again, like the reason to prune is if there's disease present, if there's wounding from storm damage or deer or rabbits or something like that, and then removal of dead material. Another thing to consider is some conifers out there, just like hardwoods, are shade tolerant. So that we'll touch on that a little bit, but always know the players, know your tree species and how that tree is going to react to pruning. And then an interesting thing about conifers is they don't have latent or hidden buds. So Jeff mentioned, I think before, that talking about, they're also called epicormic shoots or epicormic buds or adventitious buds, buds that are hidden in the bark, that when there is removal or damage to the terminal bud, there's no longer that signal coming down that says, hey, I'm the leader. So if we do prune at the improper location, there's not going to be a flush of growth, potential for a flush of growth coming out to fill that area in. So with conifers, you really need to start thinking about how to prune based on their growth habit. And you can lump conifers into different groups based on their growth habit. And for today, we're going to talk about basically just two. You've got whorled branch arrangement. So this is like spruce, firs, pines. So the photo here is a whorled branch arrangement. So every year, the buds pop, the shoots elongate, they stop growing, they harden off with that new set of buds for next year. So they produce one flush of growth annually there. And then next is the random branch arrangement crew. That's things like cedar, juniper, yew, et cetera, et cetera. So these have continuous annual growth. So knowing what you got out there and knowing how they grow is really key to pruning these correctly. So for the whorled branch arrangement, spruce and fir, these produce lateral or side buds up and down the shoots or at nodes. So that's very important to think about when you're looking on where to cut. And then pine, buds are produced at the twig tips only, usually a terminal bud with a cluster of auxiliary buds around in the whorl formation. So spruce and fir, they have a lot more lateral or side buds than pine do. So a quick thing on ID, again, you got to really know the players to know what you're getting into for pruning. Spruce and fir, that group, if you break out the whorled group into spruce and fir and then pine, the needles are attached to the twig singularly. So you can see on the photo here on the right, each needle is singularly attached to that twig. So if you want to break it down further, we're not going to talk about spruce versus fir pruning tonight, but if you're curious, spruce are square and they stick you. So the needles are round, roundish, they're square. You can roll them in your finger and they're usually quite sharp and pokey. Anyone that's loaded or unloaded spruce trees onto a semi truck or anywhere else, done some landscaping like Dr. Iles mentioned, knows that these will cut your arms up and be quite annoying. Also, their cones droop down. And then firs, we call firs are flat and friendly. So the needles are generally flat. They will not roll between your fingers. They're softer. They don't cause that irritation when they bump your skin. And they're also planar, kind of like an airplane wing, planar arrangement along the twig. And their cones stand straight up off the twig. So spruce droop, and then the cones of firs stand straight up. So for these, because you've got buds along the twigs there, these can be pruned at any time. But like Dr. Iles says, timing in the year does really matter. Mentioned pruning in late winter, right before they start growing, is both practical, but it's also kind of maybe a sweet spot where you do get that rapid wound response right as the tree begins its growing in the spring there. So if you're doing this for the spruce fir crowd, you want to prune back to the lateral bud or the side branch as close as possible, not leaving any stubs there. So Dr. Iles talked about not pruning, not clipping in that internode area. You want to go back to that node so you reduce the chance that you have that dead stub there that can be a disease entry point. So pines, a little bit of ID on pines. These have needles attached to the twigs in bundles, also called fascicles, in twos, fives, or twos, threes, and sometimes five. White pine has 5 needles per fascicle. They're like that photo. Photo's got 3 there, but the photo on the right shows a fascicle. So you have buds clustered at the terminus of the shoot. So there's no buds on the shoot. There's no buds on existing branches. So you have to be quite careful to not prune below those buds because there's nothing there to respond and make new growth if you're wanting to do that. Just kind of a resource alert, shameless plug here. We do have an online tree ID key, complete with how-to videos on how to use that key for Iowa tree species if you're curious about upping your tree ID game. So for pines, the pruning, the timing, and the technique, really pruning during what's called candle elongation is highly recommended. So in early summer, the buds have popped. You see that kind of fresh. This is kind of a year too late example here, but the terminal buds pop, they start extending. We call those candles. They have nice light color on them. In early summer, before the needles mature, you can actually snap those candles off at about 2/3 the length to kind of restrict the growth of that pine tree. But remember, there's no lateral buds, so don't prune beyond this year's current growth because there's going to be nothing there to replace it, and you'll get that kind of dead stub there that is a decay entry point. I just threw this in here. This is from our Windbreak program, but no need to panic here. We get a lot of calls on this. This is a white pine up in Northeast Iowa, and pines only keep their needles for a set number of years. And what's happening here in A, this is the current year's growth. And then B, that is last year's growth that is now senescing and falling off just as a normal reflush cycle in these pines. So this is not a disease. This is not a site issue. This is just a natural process of rejuvenation and losing these needles there. So I figured I saw it in my slide set and figured what the heck, we'll throw it in there. So no need to prune here any diseased or damaged tissue out. This is a natural deal. So finally, the random growth form. So this is things like cedar, arborvitae, aka east or northern white cedar, junipers, yews, things like that. These have scale or awl-like needles on the right here. So not attached to the twig singularly or in fascicles like we saw before. These lack whorls like the pines and the others that group do. And then these have continuous growth throughout the season. So for these, pruning timing and technique, these do, and I know a lot of folks love to shear these, which is kind of a random cut. You're not knowing really where you're hitting, but you're like trying to shape it into something desirable. These do respond well to shearing, but again, in conifers, we love that natural form and we prefer that. What happens sometimes with shearing is you get, again, when you shear it, you could have an explosion, lack of a better term, of growth at the end, which could shade the interior, causing dead spots. So really with this, I would really only recommend pruning to correct defects and damage. If you're going to do some kind of pruning to kind of reduce the size or control the size, thinning out pruning tends to work very nicely. So that's really what Jeff was talking about before. You want to cut back. I made some lines here to either a lateral branch that gives you the desired size, but again, don't cut in that internode area, as that's going to leave some entry point for decay. So these can be pruned again in late winter, and if they're kind of getting a little out of control, you want to kind of make them not as ragged looking. You could do it again in early July because they've got that continuous growth throughout the year. This is a big one that I see a lot in windbreaks, and it leads to short-lived windbreaks and compromised windbreaks. And Dr. Iles touched on this before, is pruning young as soon as you can to encourage single leaders. And like Jeff said earlier, the earlier we can get a pruning plan together, the better. So remember, these have an X current form, so they want that one dominant leader to make that nice symmetrical shape. So what happens when we have a lot of times when the leader is damaged, either wind or birds will land on it and pop it, we'll get the lateral branches trying to fight and assume dominance. So you get these number of shoots coming up trying to assume dominance of the leader. And if not attended to, what they're going to do is they're going to continue to grow up and up and up. And like Jeff showed, they're going to produce some included bark if they're not addressed. So always pick the dominant leader that you think is going to be the best and then trim the remainders. Sometimes, if needed, you can secure them, like in this Virginia Tech graphic here. You snip that damaged area off, you select the leader that you think is going to do the best job, and then you kind of tie it up, make it vertical, and secure it with this sticker or piece of wood there. This is kind of an interesting example from my backyard. Improper pruning, big times. This was after the derecho. This is a white fir. This actually, this tree shattered in half. So this included bark here, as you can see in the middle, is very weak. It's very weak union. And what happened with this old tree is no one pruned the double leaders. They eventually grew together, grew bark and grew together. Then that tree actually grew around where you could not see the included bark anymore. And I had to cut way, way, way down to even get an example of this because the tree just popped and shattered. And looking at it on the outside, you really would have known that damage was there. So correct when they're young and correct as soon as possible. So just a really quick note on storm damage recovery. This is a shot from the derecho a couple years back. Now I guess we're 3 for 3 now in derechos over the last 2 years. But a lot of similar concepts as Jeff talked about with deciduous trees, and really people get frustrated, but there's really no one cookbook recipe on storm damage recovery and pruning. It depends on the site, depends on the species, depends on kind of your objectives. But there's some kind of big things to remember. Again, these trees won't have hidden buds, and often they're shade intolerant. So you got to ask yourself, is this tree going to respond and fill that gap, or the neighbor is going to come in and fill that gap? I just included shade intolerance here because a lot of people, when they see situations like this, they'll try to pop another shade intolerant conifer in the gap, hoping that someday it can fill that gap, and it's just not going to get the shade that it needs. Again, I'm going back to my windbreak world here in a bit. But with conifers, any kind of damage, you really just want to prune back to the nearest lateral bud or branch as soon as you can. If you've got over 50% canopy loss, it's probably time to start thinking of replacement. And honestly, X current form really does help a little bit with storm resistance. This is a common concern about, can I cut those dead branches off? This is actually probably not the best shot of this. This is more of, this would be like a sanitation cut. But conifers do self-prune, so leaves are a moisture loss liability, right? So when they aren't cranking out the sugar that they need, the tree is going to get rid of them and kill them off. So Like Jeff said, if you do see some of that self pruning at the base, it is okay to cut those back, again, avoiding the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. Again, late in the winter. This would be another situation where you would cut off. I'm not going to get too far in the weeds with Swiss needle cast or rhizosphere needle cast, but if it is a sanitation cut, for example, you would want to catch that early and remove those pockets before, as soon as you can, before once you first start noticing the dieback. Again, never remove about over 30% of the canopy. This is the sugar source for the tree. I really say that a lot of the self pruning issue and like things like Swiss needle cast or rhizosphere needle cast can be avoided by proper spacing, matching the species to the site, and selecting native species when possible. I know we struggle with conifers here in Iowa, but a lot of that can be prevented by picking the right tree for the right site and spacing it right for the future. I'll zip through these. I think I'm short on time here, but this is just an example that I show folks when I'm thinking about windbreak, communicating a windbreak design to them. There's a lot more things out there that you think that are native to Iowa, or at least hardy in Iowa, that would work. And right species, right site. If you've got that makes a vigorous tree. Vigorous trees respond much more better to wounding than non-vigorous trees. Here's a cool resource alert. The Iowa Woodland Suitability Guide, if you put in your soil series, it lets you know which species do well on that soil series. One kind of last thing I was going to mention here, I'm getting a little bit into the windbreak weeds here, but if you're struggling with conifers, if they've got a lot of dieback, it most likely is the conifer is not native to Iowa, and it's probably not on the right site. One thing I've been trying folks to get to think of more is considering native hardwood trees as a replacement. And you're like, well, that's not going to be the equal windbreak performance as a conifer. That's correct, but it just takes some more hardwoods versus conifers. But there are species out there that do exhibit marcescence. So Jeff talked about fun terms to use around the dinner table. Marcescence is one. It means some degree of winter leaf retention in deciduous trees. So this is a swamp white oak here in Ames, almost notorious for this. This is a small swamp white oak that we planted in a research plot south of town. But a variety of oaks do this. Ironwood, witch hazel, hard maple to some extent do this. So if you're struggling with conifers, marcescent trees might be a good alternative. With that, that was a very 30,000 foot view, quick overview of conifers, but I can't stress enough, know your species. With conifers, we got to kind of a little easier. We love their natural form. So really, we really only want to prune when it's disease, damage, and other things that may threaten the overall health of the tree. So with that,